Imagine a small prehistoric settlement at the edge of a river. The sun is going down. People are returning from gathering food. A few hunters are carrying meat back to camp. Children are sitting near the fire, and everyone expects the evening to be ordinary. But something is wrong. A valuable tool is missing. Someone had stored food for the next morning, and now part of it has disappeared. Nobody saw anything. There are no police, no prison, no courtroom, no written law hanging on a wall. So what happens next? Someone looks around the camp. Someone starts asking questions. And eventually, people begin wondering about one person in particular. But here's the fascinating part. We will probably never know who humanity's first criminal was. There is no archaeological site labeled the first crime scene. No ancient document tells us who committed the first theft, assault, or murder. Criminal behavior almost certainly existed long before writing, cities, or formal governments, because humans were already living together. And whenever people share food, territory, tools, partners, responsibilities, and resources, another problem appears. What happens when someone takes something they shouldn't? The answer reveals something surprisingly important about human society. Before police existed, before judges existed, and before prisons existed, humans already had ways of identifying dangerous or dishonest behavior. They used something far older than a badge. They used memory, observation, reputation, witnesses, cooperation, and sometimes revenge. Crime probably started with community. To understand the first criminals, we have to go much further back than the first cities. Early human groups were small. People depended heavily on one another for food, protection, childcare, information, and survival. That created an enormous advantage, but it also created a vulnerability. Everyone knew everyone. If someone repeatedly took food without contributing, disappeared with valuable tools, attacked another member, or violated an important social rule, their behavior could become known throughout the group. In a small community, you didn't necessarily need a police department to know who caused a problem. People remembered. Imagine a hunter returning to camp with several stone tools. One particular blade is placed beside his sleeping area. The next morning, it's gone. There may be only a few people who had access to it. Nobody needs fingerprints. Nobody needs DNA testing. The investigation begins with something much simpler. Who was there? This kind of social memory may have been incredibly powerful. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies today have documented how reputation, gossip, social pressure, cooperation, exclusion, and collective decision-making can regulate behavior without centralized police forces. That doesn't mean prehistoric communities had modern criminal justice systems. They didn't. But it does suggest something important. The idea of enforcing rules is much older than the institutions that enforce them, and the rules themselves probably began with something extremely basic. Don't steal from the group. Don't attack people without consequences. Don't take more than your share, and don't put everyone else's survival at risk. The first detectives didn't need badges. Now imagine something more serious. A valuable food supply disappears. There are no written records, no security cameras, no forensic laboratory. So how could anyone figure out what happened? The answer was observation. Humans are exceptionally good at noticing patterns. A person sees someone carrying an unfamiliar object. Someone notices footprints leading away from a storage area. Someone remembers that a particular individual was near the missing food. Someone else remembers hearing movement during the night. One clue might mean nothing, but several clues together could create a story. This is where human cooperation becomes incredibly important. One person might remember what happened. Another might have seen something. Another might know where the missing object usually belonged. And another might recognize the person who suddenly possesses it. In other words, the earliest form of investigation may not have been one brilliant detective solving a mystery. It may have been a group comparing memories. And that has a fascinating consequence. The first crime investigation may have looked less like a modern police investigation, and more like an argument around a fire. Where were you? Who saw him? When did the food disappear? Who had access to it? Why do you have this object now? There was no standardized procedure, but the basic logic was already there. Something happened. Someone witnessed part of it. The community compares what people know. That is surprisingly close to the foundation of investigation itself. When suspicion became punishment. But identifying a wrongdoer creates another question. What do you do with them? This is where prehistoric justice becomes much harder to reconstruct. Different communities could have responded to wrongdoing in completely different ways. A person might be confronted. They might be forced to return what they took. They might compensate the victim. They might be publicly shamed. They might lose trust. They might be excluded from certain activities. And in some societies, serious offenses could trigger physical retaliation or even death. There was no universal prehistoric punishment system. But one powerful mechanism appears again and again in human societies: reputation. If everyone knows that someone steals, lies, or behaves violently, cooperation becomes difficult. And for a highly social species, losing cooperation can be devastating. Imagine living in a small community where survival depends on sharing information about water, animals, plants, weather, and predators. Now imagine nobody trusts you. People don't want to share food with you. They don't want to hunt beside you. They don't want to sleep near you. They don't want you near their children. You may still be physically free, but socially, you've lost something extremely valuable. This is one reason gossip may have played such an important role in human evolution. Gossip isn't just entertainment. Information about other people's behavior can help a community decide who is trustworthy, who shares, who cheats, who helps, who steals, who keeps promises. Long before written criminal records, people themselves may have been the records. But what about murder? Theft is one thing. Murder changes everything. Archaeology gives us evidence that interpersonal violence existed deep in human prehistory. Ancient skeletons sometimes show injuries consistent with violent encounters, fractures, penetrating wounds, embedded projectile points, and other trauma. But here's the important distinction. Finding evidence of violence doesn't tell us exactly what happened. A skeleton with a serious injury doesn't automatically tell us whether it was murder, warfare, an accident, or something else. Still, some prehistoric remains provide disturbing evidence that humans were capable of killing one another long before states existed. And that creates a fascinating problem. If someone killed another member of a small community, how would the group respond? There may not have been a prison to hold the accused. There may not have been a judge. There may not even have been a concept equivalent to modern criminal law. Instead, the response could depend on relationships. Was the victim related to the attacker? Was the attacker valuable to the community? Was the killing intentional? Was it an accident? Would retaliation create another cycle of violence? These questions may have been incredibly difficult for early communities, because once revenge begins, it can spread. One person kills another. The victim's relatives retaliate. The attacker's relatives respond. And suddenly, a dispute between two individuals becomes a conflict between entire families. This may help explain why formal rules and institutions eventually became so important. Human societies didn't simply need ways to punish criminals. They needed ways to stop punishment from creating even more violence. When crime became a matter for the law, thousands of years later, something changed dramatically. Humans began living in larger settlements. Agriculture created permanent communities. People accumulated stored food, land, livestock, tools, wealth, and property. And as societies became larger, personal memory alone became less useful. Imagine a village of 50 people. You might know almost everyone. Now imagine a city containing thousands of people. You can't personally know everyone. You can't rely entirely on reputation. And when property becomes more valuable, disputes become more complicated. Who owns this field? Who owns this animal? What happens if someone steals grain? What happens if someone injures another person? What punishment is considered fair? These questions eventually push societies towards something revolutionary: written rules. Some of the earliest surviving law collections come from ancient Mesopotamia. The famous Code of Hammurabi, created in Babylon around the 18th century BCE, is one of the best-known examples. It wasn't the first law code in human history, and it certainly wasn't the beginning of justice. Earlier Mesopotamian law collections existed, but Hammurabi's laws show something important about an increasingly complex society. Rules could be written down. Punishments could be specified. Different offenses could receive different penalties, and disputes could be handled through recognized institutions rather than entirely through personal revenge. This was a major transformation. The question was no longer simply, who did it? It became, what does the law say should happen? That distinction changed human civilization. So how did ancient humans catch their first criminal? The honest answer is, we don't know. We don't know the person's name. We don't know the crime. We don't know what punishment they received. And there probably wasn't one single first criminal in human history. Crime emerged alongside human social life itself. Wherever people had shared resources, relationships, territory, and rules, there were opportunities for conflict. But we can follow the evolution of how humans responded. First came observation. Someone noticed something had gone wrong. Then came memory. People remembered who was present and what had happened before. Then came witnesses and collective investigation. People compared what they had seen. Then came reputation and social pressure. A person's behavior became part of their identity within the community. Then came punishment and retaliation. And eventually, as societies became larger and more complex, came formal law, courts, officials, and eventually police. The modern detective standing at a crime scene with evidence, witnesses, records, and forensic tools may seem completely different from a prehistoric group gathered around a fire discussing a missing object. But underneath, the basic question is surprisingly similar. What happened? Who was responsible? And what should we do about it? That's the deeper story. Human civilization didn't suddenly invent justice. It built it piece by piece. A remembered rule became a tradition. A tradition became a social expectation. A social expectation became a law. And eventually, laws created institutions designed to enforce them. The first criminal may be impossible to identify, but the human desire to understand wrongdoing is ancient. Long before police stations, fingerprints, prisons, and courtrooms, humans were already watching one another. They were remembering. They were questioning. They were deciding who could be trusted. And when something threatened the survival of the group, they didn't simply ignore it. They responded. Because perhaps one of the oldest lessons in human history is this: living together requires rules. And once humans began living together, someone was eventually going to break them. If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten chapter of human history, subscribe to Tales of Sapiens. Because every ordinary system we live with today, from laws and courts to money, cities, and governments, has an extraordinary story hidden somewhere in the past. See you in the next tale.